You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Podcast where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, I am answering a question from Marian in Ireland and Gia Hoych. Sorry, that's my best Gaelic. I'm sure my pronunciation is terrible, but I'm trying to say hello in native tongue for Ireland. So hello to all of you. Thank you to all of my Irish listeners. It's been so exciting to hear from you. And actually, I've had a huge influx of all of the UK and Ireland lately. I've had a lot of people from England and Ireland and Scotland. Actually, I don't have any Wales. Okay, my Welsh people, I need you to reach out and say hello. Brenna at thekidcounselor.com. I'd love to have all of you on the other side of the pond. So thank you so much for being a part of the Play Therapy Podcast family. That's so exciting for me to know that it's stretching over onto the west side of Europe. So Marian's question today is about the initial session, however, not in the standard initial session type of context. So we've talked a lot about what the initial session looks like, what the script is to tell the child, what you say to the child when they enter into the room, how you conduct the house tree person and kinetic family drawings. If all of that is foreign to you and you have no idea what I'm talking about, we've talked about that in earlier episodes, so please go back. And then also, we've posted a lot of resources specifically about the house tree person and kinetic family drawing and first session in the collective. So if you would like access to that, please join the collective. You can do that at ccptcollective.com. And we are getting pretty close to 100, y'all. We're encroaching on the 100 member mark there. So that's really exciting. And so if you would like to be able to do live Q&A with me, have resources, find out more about initial sessions, things like that, that would be a really helpful place for you to go. All right. So if we are talking about the initial session outside of the traditional context, her question is specifically about the Touchstone story. And she talks about using the Touchstone story and wanted my thoughts. So I'm going to read parts of her email to you, and then we'll dive into some conversation. So she says, my training is child-centered, but integrative or eclectic, as you would say. And you all know how much I don't particularly favor the eclectic approach. So trained in child-centered, but it was integrative and eclectic. So then she says, listening to you speak about the power of being solely non-directive, it has led to this question. I was trained to do an approach called the Touchstone story when first meeting the child. This is where the therapist uses miniatures and tells the child a short story of their life in order to let the child know what I know about them. Their reasoning is that in doing so, you're being authentic with the child about what you know. You can address any cognitive distortions they may have about life events, reframe coping strategies as strengths, meet the child's need for safety as it counters any confusion they may have, and also they're not wondering what you know about them. I'm curious to know your thoughts and what you do. When you first meet the child, do you let them know that you talk to their parents or mention anything about what you know about them? Or do they just come in and play? Thank you for taking the time, and I'd really appreciate your input. Okay, so Marian, thank you for reaching out. And in full transparency and full disclosure, you get Brenna truth for good or for bad. You should know that by now. So in full transparency, I had never even heard of the Touchstone story. And so that I could answer this question intelligently, I did a pretty deep dive into it. And I'm kind of intrigued by the concept. Let me be clear. I'm not in favor of doing it because it's not child-centered. So let's just get that out there right out of the gate. But I'm intrigued by the intention behind the Touchstone story. And Marian, to answer your question, I think where we can meet is there are ways to address the goals and objectives of the Touchstone story while adhering specifically to CCPT principles. So I think we will figure out a way to kind of fuse those goals and process together. And then we'll get the same outcome, but with a fully adherent child-centered approach. So that's my goal for this episode. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Touchstone story, and I do think a lot of the articles that I read came out of the UK, interestingly enough. So I think this might be more of a UK-centered thing. And for those of my international people, my Aussies, my Europeans, those in Asia, would you please let me know if you use the Touchstone story, if you've heard of it? I'm curious if this is a little bit isolated to the UK or if this is just something that we don't hear a whole lot about only in the States, and everywhere else it's used a lot more readily. So I'm curious about that. But the Touchstone story seems to be pretty popular over there. And the concept is that the therapist will use dolls or miniatures or figures. And sometimes the child chooses them to represent people in their family. Sometimes the therapist chooses them. Often the parents are actually present for this. So it's a very collaborative first few minutes of the first session. So parents, therapist, and child can all be in the room together, all participating in this Touchstone story. And the dolls or miniatures or figures are used to recreate the child's life in a very short summary. So the story might look like the therapist says, 5 years ago, a little baby boy was born to so-and-so and so-and-so. And they loved him so much, and he was such a gift to them. And then 3 years later, sibling was born. And then 4 months ago, brother was born. And it goes through this narrative of the child's life with the goal of helping the child know what the therapist knows, helping the child feel connected to the therapist. And then some of the things that Marian, you mentioned, addressing cognitive distortions, reframing coping strategies as strengths, meeting the child's need for safety, and they're not wondering what you know about them. So that's, for those of you that are not familiar with Touchstone story, that's kind of the basis there. And my thoughts are for why I'm not in favor of it. Let's start there. I think it puts expectations right in the first session that you are in charge, because you sit the child down and you orchestrate this whole Touchstone story. And yes, the focus is the child, but it is still very clear that you are kind of facilitating and driving this conversation and this story. And the fact that the parent is in there, that also creates a very different dynamic, because the purpose of the first few sessions is rapport and trust and bonding to take place between the child and the therapist. That's very difficult to do when a parent or a caregiver is present, because the child already has the bond and rapport and attachment and relationship with that person. So it's easy for them to defer to that connection rather than working on building one with the therapist. So I think it puts you in charge. I think it puts a certain connotation and has certain expectations. And it's very difficult to express the freedom and the liberty and the autonomy of the child-centered model when that dynamic is already present. So there's already a parent in the room. You have to go through this process of telling the story, and the miniatures are used and all of that. So I think it just doesn't really align helpfully with the premise of you're in charge and you get to be the boss and you get to decide what we do and all of those things. Now, I can hear some of you screaming at me. You know, we have that kind of relationship, right? So I know some of you are going, but Brenna, what's the difference? The first session, you make kids sit down and draw 4 drawings and you're in charge then too. And how do you make that work? Blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to address that too. That's why we do House Tree Person the very first time, because we say to the child, we're going to do 4 drawings so that I can get to know you better. And once those 4 drawings are done, I'm never in charge again. So there's intention in the way that we phrase that. There's intention in doing it the first session, because not only are we having the child actively do something, they are actively doing the drawings, they are actively answering the questions, and then they also are helping us get to know them a little bit. So I believe, Marian, that the House Tree Person kinetic family drawing serves a lot of the same purposes of the Touchstone story, but it is more of an assessment-based or evaluative approach so that you can get your finger on the pulse of what's going on with the child week 1. The Touchstone story covers all of the past, so it really doesn't allow the child to communicate at all what's going on with them in that moment. It's addressing everything that has already happened. So I think the focus and the bent is very different when we're addressing where the child is on that first session with the House Tree Person kinetic family drawing versus we're going to tell your whole life story leading up to this point. The the dynamic shifts a little bit there. So when you asked the question, do they just come in and play? What do you let them know? Do you tell them that you talk to their parents, mention anything about them, et cetera, et cetera? Landreth has made it very clear that the only thing that we need to know about a child before we walk into a playroom with them is their name. So in answer to your question, I don't need to know anything. And yes, of course, I always know things because parents meet with me ahead of time and share a lot of stuff with me. But I don't need any of that. It doesn't influence anything that I do with them. It doesn't influence any of my conversation. It doesn't even need to be brought up because it doesn't change anything about the way that my sessions go with that child. So I never feel compelled to let a child know that I know anything about them because all I need to know is their name. Quite honestly, the initial parent consultation, and I've talked about this, and we talk about this in the coaching program and in the collective too. The initial parent consultation is not for us. And many, many therapists think that it is, quote, intake. Think that it is, I have to get the backstory, the history, whatever's gone on in the child's life. I have to do all of this documentation. I have to make all these notes. I have to come up with a treatment plan. Baloney. Said with love. We don't need any of that because it's for the parents. The parents want to share all that with us. The parents want us to know. The parents think that's going to be helpful. And I receive it and I share thoughts and I share observations and I connect it to what they'll gain in play therapy. I mean, it's useful for that consultation. But I cash all of it out of my brain and I walk into that playroom and the only thing I need to know is the child's name. So I don't feel compelled to tell them that I've talked to mom and dad. Sometimes they will ask. Sometimes they'll say, so my mom told me that she met you last week. And then I'll say, oh, she told you that she came and met with me. Yes, she came so she could see the playroom and meet with me and see if she thought this would be a fun place for you to come. So I'm very truthful with kids. I don't hide the fact that I've met with them, but it's not something that I bring up because really it's irrelevant. As soon as that child walks through the playroom door, the session is all about them. It doesn't matter what mom told me. It doesn't matter what I know. It doesn't matter anything. All it matters is that I'm present and engaged with the child. So we don't want to hide the fact that we've met with parents or we've talked to parents, but we don't need to initiate that conversation. And as far as what do I say when it's the child's first session and what does that look like? So the first thing that I do when I sit down is I go through my initial session script with children. And if you are not familiar with that, there are earlier episodes discussing that, but I'll hit highlights for you. So we talk about confidentiality. We talk about the time length. We talk about same day each week. We talk about the snack at the end. We talk about me taking notes, etc. So that script that we go through is kind of just setting the expectations so that the child doesn't have questions. However, one of my first topics of discussion with a child when they first come in is, I wonder what you know about what you're going to do when you come here. And sometimes kids will say, oh, mom told me that I just get to come and play. And I'm like, oh, thank God you listened to me. Because I give parents the script of what to tell their child about coming to me too. And it's very interesting what kids report they were told, because I'm like, that was so far off script, I might as well have not given you one because that was nothing at all what I told you to say. But every once in a while, you'll get a kid that'll say, oh, that I just get to come play. And I'm like, oh, thank you, Jesus. So then you'll get kids that say, oh, she told me that I'm going to come and talk to you about my anger problems. And I'm like, oh, holy Moses. Okay, yeah, so totally off script. Went rogue. And then you'll get some other variations of like, I don't really know, like that I can talk if I want, or I can play if I want, or whatever. So then you kind of get everything in between. And then every once in a while you get a kid that goes, they didn't tell me anything. I didn't even know where we were going. I just got in the car. So some variation of any of those responses, right? But the reason why we ask, to address your question, Marian, is I wonder what you know about what's going to happen when you're here. That gives you the opportunity to set the stage and help them feel comfortable. So, well, you're in charge and you're the boss for the whole hour and you get to decide what we play, and you can play with all the toys in most of the ways that you'd like. And then you give them their prompts of what to expect, and that's all they need. So that line of discussion of I wonder what you know is very helpful. And then I think the most effective way to address the first session, and as I was doing my deep dive into the Touchstone story, one of the articles that was published about the Touchstone story that I read quoted Landreth, and I wish I actually had it pulled up in front of me, but we just had a power outage and everything shut off on my computer, so I'm going to have to do this from memory. So I apologize if I misquote, but Landreth is quoted in this article, and my paraphrase is, you have to remember that to you, or to the child rather, you are a complete stranger. You're going back to a strange place, and you're going back there for what could be forever. And forever was in quotes, I think. And so when we're thinking about that, put yourself in the child's shoes. They don't know you. They don't know where they are. They've never been in the playroom before. They have no idea how long they're going to be back there, even if you say it's 50 minutes. I mean, 50 minutes to a kid is an eternity sometimes. They're leaving the comfort of the only person they know in the lobby to go back with someone they've never met. And I mean, all of that is very, very unnerving. And look, there are some kids that are happy as clams. You're like, I wonder if you're ready to go play. Yeah. And like, they don't even say goodbye to their parent and they're in the playroom before you can catch up, right? But then you have those that are a little bit concerned or worried or nervous or anxious or whatever. And so Landreth addresses that, right? And says, look, you have to remember what this experience is like for the child. So Marian, I understand the purpose of the Touchstone story is to kind of eliminate that, right? You bring the parent back, so then they have that person of comfort, and you get to kind of have that communication right from the beginning of the session so that they get to know you a little bit and they know what you know about them and all of those things. But this is why what we say to kids in the lobby is so important. Our very first communication with children, the very first time that they come, when we go out to the lobby, that's why it's so crucial that we execute this appropriately. That's why we get down on our knees or we squat or we do whatever we have to do so that we are on a lower level than the child. And we gently introduce ourselves and we gently talk about how mom or dad or whomever has some work that they have to do because they have to fill out all of these papers. That's why I do not have intake paperwork completed digitally. That's why I don't have intake paperwork completed ahead of time. There's purpose in everything I do, y'all. There should be purpose in everything you do. Don't be a haphazard, child-centered play therapist. Think through what sets you up for success. Think through what your kids and your parents and you need and make it happen. So I give mom, dad, whomever a clipboard with all of the intake paperwork, and I say, Mom has to sit out here and do all of this work. Look at all of these papers, and you get to go back into a huge playroom and you get to play the whole hour. I think you get a much more fun thing than mom does. And as soon as you have that kind of conversation, 98% of the time, the child is happy to go back. And then I typically even joke about halfway through the session, you're having so much fun in here. I wonder if mom's done with her paperwork yet. And then as we're leaving the session, I say, oh, we can see if mom was able to finish all of that work that she had to do. So there's intention in going out to the lobby, helping the child understand what to expect, making it lighthearted, making it fun, engaging with them on an age-appropriate level, and reassuring them. And as soon as our time's up, as soon as you're done playing, we're going to come right back out here and we're going to meet up with mom again when we're all done. And as long as you have that discussion with them, they feel comfortable. So a lot of it falls on us to create the environment and the structure that makes a child feel at ease. But then the goals of the Touchstone story are so that the child is able to build that connection, build that relationship, feel comfort, feel that they're able to come back and play. We can do that through child-centered approaches. So, Marian, thank you so much for the question. I love it when I'm exposed to things that I've never heard of before, and I was able to really kind of dive into the Touchstone story, and I found it kind of fascinating. So I'm very grateful that you sent that question. I hope that was helpful to all of you as well, because it's helpful to be reminded, even from Landreth's words, how hard it can be for a child to come back and play with us for the first time, or even maybe the first few times. And it's frustrating for us as therapists sometimes when a child doesn't want to go back. or wants to sit on mom's lap and won't look at us and won't talk to us and won't get up and all those things. But we're a stranger and they don't know us. They don't know the environment. They don't know what to expect. That's scary. And to honor that is helpful. And so although I do think the Touchstone story is designed to honor that, I think there are child-centered ways that we can do it as well. So grateful for you sending that in. And if you would like me to cover a question, you can always email me at brenna@thekidcounselor.com. And again, if you want to join the collective, it'll give you quicker responses because you'll be able to do Q&A live twice a week. And that is ccptcollective.com. I'm super grateful. I sent out an email newsletter this week. By the way, if you all are not on my email newsletter, go to playtherapynow.com and you can sign up for that. But I sent out an email newsletter this week talking about child-centered play therapist as a second or third career. And I just said, hey, like if that resonates with you, will you shoot me an email? Oh my gosh, y'all, I've gotten so many emails, like my inbox is blowing up. I love it. So I'm going to probably do a bonus episode in the next week or so where I'm going to dive in a little bit more deeply and tell some stories of people who have emailed me from all over the world telling me that CCPT found them. And I know we usually say that we find it, but I deeply, truly believe that CCPT finds us. And that's why I think there are so many career changes that lead us to child-centered play therapy. So I was so excited to hear all of your responses to the newsletter, and I really appreciate that. So we're going to cover an episode on that soon. All right, y'all. I am so grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you. I love you. You know how much you mean to me. We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.